picture, my first slide. This is my husband. I brought him along. So Raul is an organic farmer. He's been farming organically for 30 years. He currently teaches organic farming at UC Davis, where he also runs a certified organic farm on campus. So you may think that a geneticist and an organic farmer reside at polar opposites of the agricultural industry. You may even think we don't talk to each other. But in fact, we do, and it's easy because we both have the same vision, an ecologically based sustainable agriculture. Many of our friends, family, and colleagues have asked us, well, what are genetically engineered crops, and are they safe to eat, and are they safe for the environment? Whereas many of our scientific colleagues have asked us the question, well, organic farming is nice, but can it produce enough food to feed the ever-growing population? So this book is, Raul and I wrote a book together called Tomorrow's Table, which I would show you, but I can't get the little thing to it. Oh, okay, thank you. That's good to know. So here it is. So we wrote this book in response to those questions, and our intention in this book is to give readers a better idea of what organic farmers and geneticists actually do, and to also distinguish between fact and fiction on the debate on crop genetic engineering. And we do this through stories and conversations with friends and students. Now, the major theme of our book is that the judicious incorporation of these two important strands of agriculture, genetic engineering and organic farming, is key to helping feed the growing population in an ecologically balanced manner. And today I will tell you how we came to that conclusion. But first, we need to talk about the kind of agriculture we have now. And I thank Dixon for that really excellent talk and introduction to my talk, because as he mentioned, we use a lot of pesticides. And so here's a potato farmer in Peru growing these potatoes that are very susceptible to a fungal disease called Phytophthora. And he's out there with his pesticide, posing for the camera. And if you notice, he doesn't have any gloves on. He does not have a mask. And he has no eye protection. So there are some pesticides that are safe, but they're not always used safely. And so that leads globally to 3 million cases of severe pesticide poisonings each year, as well as 300,000 deaths. This is what we know. And in the United States, well, in California alone, we have every year over 1,000 pesticide poisonings. And it's also very clear, scientific data is very clear that we have that pesticide use is associated with increased risks of many diseases such as prostate cancer, Parkinson's, and other diseases. Primarily, these diseases are affecting the farm workers that are mostly exposed to these pesticides. And also, as was described so well, I actually have the same slide. The audience is really going to get this point. Conventional agriculture depends on synthetic fertilizers. So here is a farmer in China dropping some synthetic fertilizers onto his corn crop. And what happens with these fertilizers, which contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, they're very soluble, so they run off into the groundwater and surface water. And here is that slide once again. So this is a satellite photo of the Gulf of Mexico, and in the dark orange and red are areas of low oxygen. So the reason the oxygen is low is because the fertilizer provides nutrients for algae, which grow very rapidly. Microbes come in and then degrade that, and they suck, during this process, they suck all the oxygen out of the water. Well, why does that matter? This is that 6,500 square mile dead zone. It matters because it kills everything in the water. That's why it's called a dead zone. So this occurs every summer at the Gulf of Mexico. So let's talk about, so that's the kind of agriculture we have. What kind of agriculture do we want? And Raul and I feel that it's really important when we're thinking about agriculture to think about the overall goals of sustainability. And those are, we want to provide abundant, safe, and nutritious food. This is very basic. We want to reduce harmful environmental inputs, and this includes not only synthetic fertilizers and pesticide. We also want to reduce the use of energy. So energy, I should say agriculture uses a lot of energy. We want to protect insect, plant, and microbial biodiversity. We want to provide healthful conditions for farm workers, and they're often not thought about when we're thinking about a sustainable future. We want to, my husband's a farmer, so of course I need to say maintain the economic viability of farmers and rural communities, and we need to foster soil fertility. There's thousands of square miles of soil that's lost every year through farming. So how can we do this? So organic farming really developed in response to these kinds of problems in conventional agriculture. Organic farmers, rather than using pesticides, they use beneficial insects to prey on many of the pests of crops. They rotate their crops so insect populations have less of time to build up. They use compost to fertilize the soil rather than synthetic fertilizers. So this has been a very effective approach in addressing some of the problems I mentioned. Organic farms use 97% less pesticide. That's because their synthetic pesticides are not allowed in organic farming systems. They're twice as energy efficient, and this is almost entirely due to the fact that they don't use synthetic fertilizers, which are require a lot of fossil fuels to make. Organic farms compared to conventional farms harbor increased microbial and insect diversity. They do not require synthetic fertilizers. Problem solved, right? No. There are a couple drawbacks. One of them is that right now organic farming supplies only 1 to 3% of global agriculture. That means the other 97 to 99% have the issues that I just spoke about. So we need to move those other farms to a more sustainable approach. Organic farms, as well as all farms around the world, depend on genetically improved varieties. So that's the seed. And farmers are always looking for good seed, better seed. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And also, very importantly, although some organic crops, depending on the environment, can yield as much as conventionally produced food, there are in many cases where organic crops do not yield as much as conventional farms. And let's talk about why that matters. So there are today greater than 1 billion people undernourished. This is about 1 out of 6 of the people that live on this planet. Many of the undernourished people are children less than 5 years old. There are 24,000 deaths each year from malnutrition. And as was pointed out from our previous speaker and several other speakers, by the year 2050, we're going to have more people. In fact, the population is expected to increase from the current 6.7 to 9.2 billion people. So how can we grow enough food to feed all these people? And there's another important issue related to yield, which is that if we do not increase yield, if we continue with current farming practices, we'll have to double the world's cropland. If we move to organic, we'll need to more than double the world's cropland. And as has been mentioned by our previous speaker and other speakers, this will require deforestation, vast deforestation. So imagine your own communities with twice as much land put under to plow. And every farm, even organic farms, harbor much less biodiversity. That's because their native habitat has been destroyed. Increasing the number of farms around the world will further strain our water supplies, cause more soil erosion, and affect our waterways. So what we know is that if we continue with current farming practices, vast amounts of wilderness will be lost, millions of birds and billions of insects will die. Something like 70 million birds die every year as a toxic result of pesticide use. Farm workers will be at increased risk for disease, and the public will lose billions of dollars as a consequence of environmental degradation. Now this is, there must be a better way to go. And this is as important a problem, I would argue, as global warming. And it's also very interrelated to global climate change because, as I mentioned, agriculture is very energy intensive. So before I get started to tell you the solution, you need to understand a little bit about plant breeding and about where your food comes from. So on the bottom of the slide, you can see the corn that you're most familiar with. Very tasty. Well, the progenitor of this corn is this variety that is shown above. This is called teosinte. And 8,000 years ago, this is what the Native Americans were growing. This teosinte, to get to the grain, you have to hit it with a hammer and to break open the grain. And over the years, Native Americans made some basic crosses. So this is basic breeding, pollination. And they then developed a new variety, and through breeding developed another new variety. And today we have modern corn. This ear of corn produces 100 times more food than the progenitor. And in fact, so this is what we call a domesticated crop. It's domesticated. It does not occur in the wild. In fact, everything you eat is domesticated. I would argue that very few of you ever eat a wild thing. And this is important because it's important to understand that farmlands are full of domesticated crops. So now I'm going to talk about genetic engineering. So genetic engineering is different than conventional breeding, but they have the same goal. The goal is a domesticated crop that's genetically modified, okay? So all you need to know about the difference between genetic engineering and conventional breeding is two things. So with conventional breeding, you're mixing large sets of uncharacterized genes during the breeding process. With genetic engineering, it's an engineering process. So you take 1 to 2 very well characterized genes and you put them into the plant. Another major difference is that with conventional breeding, the genes that are transferred have to be transferred between the same species or very closely related species. Genetic engineering allows for transfer of a gene from any species. So the result is a new variety, whether it's from conventional breeding or genetic engineering, and that new variety behaves in the farmer's hands however he normally handles that seed. So genetically engineered crops produce seed the same way as a conventionally bred crop. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories to give you an idea of the power of this technique. So this is a papaya. It's not very pretty. These are these ring spots on this papaya. And that's because this papaya is infected with papaya ring spot virus. So plants get diseases like humans get diseases. And this is a particularly devastating disease. And in fact, viral diseases of plants are some of the worst problems in agriculture. In the 1950s, in the United States, almost all our papaya came from the island of Oahu in Hawaii. In the 1950s, this virus destroyed the entire papaya crop. The farmers had no choice but to abandon their papaya plantations and start again on the island of Hawaii. So the idea is, okay, let's move to another island. Hopefully the virus won't come to this island. But it did. In 1992, the virus was discovered in Hawaii, on the island of Hawaii. And within just a very few years, the production plummeted. So by 1995, the papaya production was approximately half as what it was. So these are small local growers, and this is their livelihood. So this is a very serious problem. So then along comes our hero. This is Dennis Gonzalez. He grew up in Hawaii. He's a scientist that trained at Cornell University. And in the late 70s, about 30 years ago, he he predicted that the virus was going to jump islands. And this is really just at the beginning of genetic engineering. So what he did is he took a snippet of a mild strain of the papaya ring spot virus, and he engineered it into the papaya plant. So he immunized the papaya plant against this virus. So this is similar to how humans have been immunized against smallpox and polio. And the results were dramatic. The genetically engineered papaya yielded 20 times more fruit than the non-genetically engineered papaya. And today, 90% of all the papaya from Hawaii is transgenic. The occurrence of this virus has drastically been reduced. And this reduction in what we call viral titer, this reduction in the virus, has benefited organic growers as well. So one thing I didn't mention, organic growers are not allowed to grow genetically engineered crops. But in this case, they're actually benefiting because there's less virus around, so there's less virus to infect their crops as well. So in this case, genetic engineering was the most appropriate technology to approach this problem. There was no conventional approach, and there was no organic approach. Here's a cotton bollworm. This is the insect emerging from his egg. This is a very serious insect, and it's controlled through insecticides. In fact, cotton uses 25% of the world's insecticide. The Environmental Protection Agency considers that half of these insecticides are highly toxic, possible or known carcinogens. So geneticists took advantage of something that organic farmers have known. There's a small bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, which is a naturally occurring bacterium, produces a small protein called Bt that targets this insect. It's harmless to human beings. That's why organic farmers use it. And it's been used since the 1930s by organic farmers. Geneticists introduced this gene into cotton, and this is one of the main crops that's being grown around the world. So Bt cot kills 90% of cotton bollworms. And there's really good data now of what's happened after the adoption of Bt cotton. So in China, insecticide use fell by 156 million pounds in a single year. So that's equivalent to the amount of pesticide we spray in California every year. And California produces half the fruits and vegetables in the United States. So that's to give you an idea of how much pesticide this is. In India, yields increased 80% on small farms compared with neighboring plots growing conventional cotton. And that's primarily because Indian growers cannot afford to buy insecticides to control the pests. So they didn't really have a tool before GE cotton came along. In Arizona, growers were able to cut their insecticide use in half. And in addition, ecologists have gone out into those fields and they see a vast increase in insect biodiversity measured by the ant and beetle population. And that's because these farmers are spraying a lot less insecticides. So this is a very powerful technology, but it's just seed. The seed has to be partnered with really good farming practices, because we know that if you just plant one single seed and have a monoculture, you're going to have other pests that will attack these crops. So I want to just finish. I might need to use a minute of your time. Just to finish on my own work. So I work on rice, which feeds 50% of the world. And 25% of the world's rice is grown in flood-prone areas. Now, in these areas, flooding is a serious problem. So every year, farmers can suffer 1 to several floods a year. And these floods can sometimes wipe out the entire crop, causing about $1 billion of damage every year. And this loss disproportionately affects the poorest farmers in the world. So in this region are 145 million people. 75 million people live on less than $1 a day. So you think of rice as liking water. Well, it does, but it doesn't like to be completely submerged. If it's completely submerged, it'll die within 2 or 3 days. In eastern India, there was a very interesting and unique variety that's able to stay underwater for 14 days. It's like it just holds its breath. And then when the flood is gone, it starts to breathe again. but it hasn't been used agriculturally because it has poor grain and yield qualities. Breeders have been trying 50 years to introduce this trait into cultivated varieties, but the farmers have rejected those varieties either because of poor yield or poor taste. So my laboratory began a collaboration about 12 years ago with David McKill at the International Rice Research Institute, and he asked us if we'd be able to clone this gene, and we did. So that gene was cloned a couple years ago. It's called sub1A. And Dave McKill now has used marker-assisted breeding, which is kind of a hybrid between genetic engineering and conventional breeding, to introduce this gene into many different varieties. And here is an example. If you look at Samba, so this field was flooded, and then the floods were removed, and this is what the fields look like a few weeks later. Samba does very poorly. You can see right away there's a very poor stand. Samba sub1, that contains just a tiny bit of the genome of that variety I told you, FR13A, has very high yields. In fact, the yields are 5 to 6 more in field trials. Well, next week I'm going to be in this field in Bangladesh, so you can see my carbon consumption diet is very poor. It's going very poorly this month. So farmers have been now testing these seeds. So we introduced sub1 into a variety that's locally adapted called Swarna. And there's been terrible floods in Bangladesh, both the last few years. And sub1 Swarna rice is yielding 2 to 3 times more grain than conventional varieties. So today, the farmers are now bulking up the seed and sharing it with their neighbors. So last question, are GE crops safe to eat and safe for the environment? And this question, of course, is very critical, and people are concerned about their health and the health of the environment. Well, the science is in. 1 billion acres of genetically engineered crops have been planted. The most prestigious scientific agencies of world experts have looked at the GE crops on the market and have concluded they're safe to eat. The last time you and the public probably heard this talk of a broad consensus of scientific opinion probably had to do with global warming. So if you remember, on the right end of the political spectrum was sort of scoffing at this broad consensus of scientific opinion. Well, nowadays the left is scoffing at the broad consensus of scientific opinion. There has not been a single case of adverse health or environmental impacts, and I want you to think about this in terms of those 300,000 deaths every year from pesticide. There's no scientific basis for ruling out genetic engineering, and the National Academy of Science and other academies have concluded that the process of genetic engineering presents similar risks as conventional breeding. So it's important to remember, though, that each crop has to be considered on a case-by-case basis because it depends on which trait is being introduced. So I want to close with a quote from one of the most important environmental activists of our time. And if you don't mind, I'll just read it. A truly extraordinary variety of alternatives to the chemical control of insects is available. Some are already in use and have achieved brilliant success. All have this in common. They are biological solutions based on understanding of the living organisms they seek to control and of the whole fabric of life to which these organisms belong. Specialists representing various areas of the vast field of biology are contributing. Entomologists, pathologists, geneticists, physiologists, biochemists, and ecologists, all pouring their knowledge and their creative inspirations into the formation of a new science of biotic controls. So I'll just leave you with the thought, for a truly sustainable agriculture, we need to use the best science and the best farming practices that are available. Thank you.